Well, I'm going to start out this morning talking a little bit about what is hypnosis, what is trance, a little bit of a historical perspective on it, kind of pre-Ericksonian and post-Ericksonian. I'm one of these people, by the way, that believes that Ericksonianism died in 1980 when Erickson died, and that we're really in a post-Erickson era, most properly. So I'm not going to stand up here and tell you I'm Ericksonian, although I had the privilege of studying with him for about 5 years. And learned a lot from him, and also, I think, in some ways learned the limitations of some of his models. So I'm not Ericksonian, I guess. I'm Carlofian. I can. A little bit about the cognitive mechanisms of hypnosis, as I see them, at least. And then I think what I'd like to do is just simply go through the major hypnotic phenomena and talk a little bit about how one produces those phenomena, so we identify them and know how to get there to some extent. And then we'll switch to trance induction and talk generally about trance induction and sort of the difference between traditional and post-Ericksonian trance induction. And a little bit about assessment for trance induction. We've worked up when I say we, a colleague, Steve Feldman, and I worked up an assessment schema that I think is pretty good for assessing what kind of induction and what kind of applications to use. We'll talk a bit about the utilization principle. Then I'm going to, I don't know if you've had any of this, but I'm going to give you a fair background in direct hypnotic technique. I learned, by the way, by learning direct technique first. 15 years ago, we were slapping people on the forehead and grasping their carotid arteries and doing these really bad things. And that's how I learned. And then I met Erickson. So by then I was already a trance jockey and knew something about hypnosis. And I think that there's some wisdom to learning hypnosis that way. I think that learning direct induction is good because you don't have to worry so much about the technique, because the technique is fairly straightforward, and you can see how people respond to trance inductions and what trance indicators are and how to manage trance. Unfortunately, and I'm not taking shots at people when I say this, but unfortunately a lot of the training today, it seems to me, is teaching people how to mumble and how to talk in these crazy non sequiturs that don't necessarily make much sense. So I think to have to learn the indirect technique and have to learn about trance at the same time is really too much. So we're going to take it from direct to indirect, if that's all right. And then we'll talk considerably about indirect techniques, and then trance utilization strategies, and then a bit on self-hypnosis. And that should take us through the weekend. If you would just take a piece of paper and hold it out in front of you and look at it. And hold it out. If your arm gets tired, just forget your arm or something. And look at the piece of paper. And I'm going to ask you to repeat silently to yourself the following sentence. I am going to drop this. And just keep saying it to yourself as you watch the paper. Over and over to yourself again. I'm going to drop this. I'm going to drop this. As you continue to say this, I want you to try to drop it. You'll find out you can't. As you continue to watch the paper, as you continue to say it, try and drop it. Your fingers are stuck together. You can't drop it. You try. The more you try, the more difficult it becomes to do. Continue to try. Now, stop saying it to yourself, and if you feel like completing the process, you can drop it if you want to, but you don't have to. Okay. Very nice. Sometimes it feels good just to get it done with, doesn't it? Yeah. Well, what is that? When I was first trained in hypnosis, we had a concept we called subconscious panic, and I've never found a better term for it. So let's talk a little bit about what subconscious panic is, and I'll let you brew on that then when I tell you a little bit about myself. Subconscious panic is this notion where you're put into a situation where you make a test of behavior. The test here was trying to drop it. And the situation is set up in a way that the test must fail. And I'll tell you why the test must fail in just a moment. In the way I was taught, at least, the subconscious then takes literally the notion, you try to drop it, you can't, therefore you can't. Then you start the process of auto-suggesting to yourself, I can't drop it. That's what we refer to as subconscious panic. It's at the basis of a number of what are referred to as tests. I don't know, those of you who've had hypnotic training, were you told about tests? Yeah. And there's a number of sort of classical tests, and I'm going to demonstrate those to you in just a moment, that operate on the same principle. How many, for example, well, let's just do another one. This is fun, right? Close your eyes. And what I'd like you to imagine, with your eyes closed, is that On the top of your head is a tiny little window. And through that window you can see the ceiling. So I just want you to look up and look through the window and imagine that you can see the ceiling. Maybe start counting the little holes in it or something. And just watch it. And as you're watching the ceiling through the window on the top of your head, I want you to understand that your eyes are locked together and you can't open them. And the more you try and open them, the more difficult it becomes, because as you continue to watch, they're locked. And the more you try, the more they lock together. And they're stuck. You can't open those eyes. Now relax, stop looking at the ceiling, and let your eyes open. It's a trick that if you do roll your eyes back, it's very difficult to open them. So what happens is, right, try it. Just close them and roll them back first. Don't roll them back before you close them. And you say it's very difficult. All right. So it's a trick. But the way the trick works is you create behavior that you can then utilize. And you say to someone, because your eyes are rolled up, you can't open them. They test it. They try to open it, find out they can't, and then they begin to auto-suggest to themselves, I can't open my eyes, which is very effective. I'll talk a little bit later about strategies in which you use people's auto-suggestion as the intervention. When they won't or aren't interested in listening to your suggestions, then you talk in a way such that they have to listen to their own. People, for example, that do a lot of auto-suggesting when you're doing an induction and may counter-suggest what you're saying, sometimes it's helpful to tell them to listen to your words and repeat them to themselves, so you sort of jam that internal dialogue. I want to just tell you a bit more about me, just so you sort of know who's up here and what you spent your money on. When I studied with Erickson, I was strategic hypnotherapist, and I had a sort of personal transformation. Well, not sort of. I had a personal transformation about 8-10 years ago in this process, where I suddenly realized that my attempt to be one-up and tricky and manipulative was really much more about my avoidance of my own issues of intimacy. It was really much more about my need to feel omnipotent. And I must tell you that when I started studying hypnosis, I was 22 years old and going through a delayed adolescent identity crisis. And I had the unconscious fantasy that hypnosis would make me powerful. And I realized that was my motives for being a hypnotherapist, and for especially wanting to be an Ericksonian hypnotherapist, because when I read his books, I thought he was some sort of wizard that walked on water. And so I've abandoned that kind of one-up stance. What I'm going to teach you is pretty technique-oriented, and I'm going to leave it up to you to integrate it into issues of self and issues of clinical practice. Some of what I teach you I don't even do anymore. And I'd be happy to talk with you about that at another time, perhaps. But I see my job here today to teach you, the next 3 days, to teach you about technique. And I'll leave it up to you to integrate that. And one final note, one final caveat, I guess, and that is that I was involved in the NLP movement when I was a young man in my mid-20s, in the mid-70s. And I was very closely associated with Bandler and Grinder, as a matter of fact, and enjoyed that and learned a lot, and was sort of part of that inner circle. Let's talk a little bit about what hypnosis is. I tend to think of it in terms of it being a relationship that allows for non-linear processing modes. In our conscious minds, we think in straight lines. If, for example, I ask you to tell me your favorite piece of music, but not to use your unconscious mind, which of course is impossible, but if I asked you to do that, the way you'd have to do that is you'd have to take every piece of music you'd ever heard and compare it with every other piece of music you've ever heard, and eventually come to a conclusion and tell me the conclusion. That's how you would do it consciously. Unconsciously, you can tell me like that. Now, chances are you're going through a similar process unconsciously, but it's more circular. It's not as linear. Okay? So I tend to think of the unconscious as a non-linear processing mode, where time is suspended, where causality is circular instead of linear. Okay? And it's a state between people, or in the auto-hypnotic state, it's a relationship between the conscious and the unconscious. I'd like to just try something, I think, that'll begin to show you maybe more practically what a state of hypnosis is and perhaps what it isn't. And so in a moment, I'm going to ask you to do something that's impossible to do with your conscious mind. Oh, yeah? I can just hear it. So tell who the challenged people are. But it's impossible to do with your conscious mind what I'm going to ask you to do. And as a matter of fact, you may not even understand consciously what I'm going to ask you to do. But I'm going to ask you to try nevertheless. So keep in mind that you can try and think about what it is consciously that I'm going to ask you to do, but you really won't be able to figure it out. But unconsciously, you'll be able to figure it out, most likely. And so when I ask you to do this thing that I'm going to ask you to do, what I'd really like you to do is just give it your best shot consciously, thinking that perhaps the choice that you make will be the correct choice for what I have in mind and what might profit you to experience. But if you don't understand consciously what I'm going to ask you to do, that's okay too, because you have an intuitive mind, and it's your intuitive mind that can make sense of what I'm talking about. And don't worry about getting it wrong, because there's a number of right ways of doing it, and it's really just to have the experience, really, that I'm talking about. So in a moment when I ask you to do this, just use some concentration and direct your attention in some ways that may help you to understand the intent behind the message, as well as the message itself, because those two things, as you know, can sometimes be different in normal speech, where you can think you're listening at one level, but understand that another part of you can already be listening at another level and be making its own conclusions and be having its own experience. And so in a moment when I ask you to do this thing, please, just as best you can, attempt to go along with it and try and find out if you could make the proper choice, because choice is of the essence. And so what I'm going to ask you to do now, and understand that there's no way you can understand this consciously, but there may be a way that unconsciously you can find yourself to be doing it, is to simply look down at that hand which you think could be the first hand that your unconscious mind will allow to become numb, and just look at it. And as you watch it, I just want you to determine if your choice was correct or if it could be the left hand. It doesn't really matter which hand, because the important thing is your ability to sense the difference. And as you watch it, the unconscious mind sometimes has a way of sort of trickiness, and you may think that the left one is the right one to become numb, but it could be the one remaining that is left to experience the state. The most important thing is your capacity to learn, and to learn that that sense of tingling numbness as it develops is really of your own creation, and you can do with it what you want, and really perhaps experience it beginning gradually to move into the hand from the fingertips or from the edge of the hand. It sometimes starts there, although other people can experience it already moving past the wrist. And I don't know if it could get all the way to the elbow before the other one had a chance to catch up or not. It really makes no difference, because your hands can have a mind of their own, an interesting thought, as you realize that your body can sit in the chair without you really needing to be attentive to it, because it does keep just the right amount of muscle tension and relaxation. That's progressive and something that everybody really enjoys. So as you experience this creeping sense of doubt about whether you'd made the right choice or whether it could move on its own, the most important thing for you to realize is that there's really no need to have to strain to keep your eyes open. In fact, some people enjoy the experience of simply allowing them to close and relaxing as you await these responses. And if those hands should begin to feel so heavy that you couldn't lift them, that would be an experience of value. It might be interesting to just discover that one of them was stuck to the leg, or that you were stuck to the chair, or, you know, a name can stick on the tip of your tongue without you really needing to think about it that much. We've all been stuck in a situation that we tried so hard to get out of that we became even more stuck, and even more so. And so as you take a deep breath and allow yourself to simply settle down in the chair and be with your own thoughts and associations, you might even recall other times in which that body was experiencing this state and the lack of a need to have to do anything but just sit there and drift and enjoy drifting and exploring your own potentials and your own altered states. And as that sensation continues to develop in the hands and the arms, and as the shoulders become more heavy, in some cases lighter, the most important thing is your sense of control and the sense that you have control of so much that happens in that mind-body learning state that you don't really appreciate consciously, because it is your unconscious mind that made the choice for you to have this experience progressively. Now in a moment, I'm assuming that you will enjoy making a special kind of discovery, and in a moment when I count to 3, let us discover together if you will awaken from the neck up without needing to awaken that body, or if you will instead awaken as a person without needing to awaken as a body. And the choice is the choice of the unconscious mind to provide you with an experience of value. So when I reach the count of 3, let us make that discovery together, that when those eyes open, you can make the discovery of how your unconscious mind chose to proceed. And it might even happen that as I count, you might enjoy a progressive sense of deepening and comfort, more so with each breath, so that at the count of 3, when the eyes open, there's really no need to have to do anything but just sit there and be aware of those differences. And 1. That's right. It's a very pleasant and very automatic and voluntary state. 2. And 3. Now, I think you'll discover that you can speak without really needing to move, and I'm not going to ask you to lift your arms at this point, because you can simply talk with me and I'll listen to you. I'm curious if anybody would like to describe the present state of that body and what they're experiencing. Anybody, just shout it out or talk it out. Hands and arms are very heavy. Okay. Warm was the word? Lack of tension. A numbness. Past the elbows? Legs. I think maybe it moved from the legs into the hand. That's a nice way of sharing the experience. What else? Anybody else? Arms so heavy they can't be lifted? Do you think you could let them become that heavy? When you think that they're that heavy, why don't you just nod your head to let me know? Anybody else? What is your experience? You're nodding your head. Are they so heavy?
They're very heavy.
Very, very. Like
A bookend.
a bookend. Okay. Who else? Anybody? Just say it.
Relax.
Relax. Yeah.
The arm jerk.
The arm jerked initially, and what is the arm doing now? Very heavy. So heavy, perhaps, that it could stick to the leg, do you suppose? Seems like it could. Interesting to be stuck in order to learn about becoming unstuck, isn't it? And how are the arms now? You can still lift them, okay. May I ask you if it's an uncomfortable notion for you not to be able to lift your arms? Is that not okay with you? Probably not okay. Okay, then you needn't do that. I certainly don't want you to do something you're not comfortable with.
An experience of heavy that you know you can do something about it, but you don't want to.
You just don't really want to. Yeah, I think you could, don't really want to. Just like you probably think you could say your name. I take it. It's a reasonable request. You think you could say your name? Do you think you would enjoy the experience of discovering that if you looked at me, you couldn't, but you could say it only if you looked away? You would enjoy that experience. It's the experience of being able to remember it, but perhaps not being able to say it. So look at me, keep me in focus, and just discover that you can think it, but what happens when you try and say it? Yes, it won't come. Look away. Can you say it now?
Mm-hmm.
Well, go ahead. Okay, look at me and try. And what happens?
Doesn't want to come.
It just doesn't want to come out. Okay, interesting. Good, thank you. Strange. Okay, well, I don't know. You've never had something stuck on the tip of your tongue? Are your hands stuck?
I don't want to let
You don't want to lift them, okay. Well, what if you had the experience of knowing your name, but looking at me and being unable to say it? What would that be like? That would be strange, unless your name is strange, of course. Okay. Why don't you just look at me, concentrate on me, think about what I said, and think about the heaviness in those arms, and perhaps you too could have a strange experience. What would happen if you tried to say it? You could think of it, but what?
say it.
You couldn't say it, that's right. Now look away, and say it.
That's all.
And look at me. Okay, very good, thank you. That's good, all right. Who else? What other kinds of experiences are you having? You need to push your glasses up? All right. Well, a person should be able to push their glasses up even if they can't say their name, shouldn't they? I would think so. I would think so. Why don't you look at me very intently, think about what I've said to you, experience the heaviness in at least one of the hands, and try and say your name. And now look away and say your name. Yeah, I think it's okay to be able to lift your hands and not be able to say your name as well. Okay. All right, let's go a little bit farther with this. Who else? Don't have to lift your hands unless you want to. One of the definitions of hypnosis is that the conscious, or operational definitions, is that the conscious mind gets distracted in some task, counting sheep, or concentrating on breathing, so that's okay. Or even focusing on some external event, traffic noises, or, I don't hear them now, but something like that. So that's an okay way of proceeding. Mantra. Okay, anybody else having a unique experience? How many of you feel that you probably could stand up but aren't so sure? You can tell me with nods of your head, but aren't so sure. Yeah. What? I can't tell if that means yes, I'm sure, no, I'm not, or probably could, but couldn't. Okay. It'd be interesting to discover that you were stuck to the chair, wouldn't it? That would be a useful experience. It's back for some of you. In order to be able to stand up, you'd have to be able to uncross your legs, wouldn't you? Mm-hmm. But if you couldn't uncross your legs, you couldn't really stand up, could you? So what would happen if you tried to stand up? You would fall over. That's right. That's right. Okay. Now, what does all of this mean? If you're comfortable where you are, you can just go ahead and be where you are. If you'd like to sort of come back to more of that bushy-tailed, wide-awake place, you can do that as well. And the way to do that is simply close your eyes. And I'm going to count from 20 to 1, and I'll give you a choice. As I count from 20 to 1, you can find yourself kind of reuniting with that body and reorienting to the room. Or, if you'd prefer, you could go a little bit further into this with each count. It's certainly a fine way of learning. 20, and a little more in whatever direction you're choosing to go in. 19, 18, 17, 16, 15. And one of the nice things about this sort of count is that it can remind you of times in your life in which you felt a sense of mastery along with relaxation. And 12, 11, and you're halfway there now. And 10, 9. And if I was being tricky, I might say 10, 11, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3. Take a nice deep breath now. 2, and 1. Eyes open, and those of you that wish to, may feel like stretching. I do that at the beginning because a lot of hypnotic training sort of is mumbo-jumbo stuff, but you never really get the chance to see phenomena. And so I think it's useful to start out like this, knowing that this is a real thing, whatever that means. Let's talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about what happened and how and why and what that meant. And that certainly didn't look like people dropping out of their chairs and sleepy, heavy, tired and that kind of stuff, but some hypnotic phenomena occurred. So how do we make sense of that? What happened in the room? What's your notion of that? It felt like choice.
had choice.
Yeah. Yeah. You thought. I thought I gave you a lot of choice. Yeah.
I'm not sure that that's what happened. That's what I consciously decided in the beginning.
Your right hand looks awake to me. Is it? But of course, by implication, what? It's more awake than the left hand, right? And I'm sorry, the left hand is the one that went first? Okay. Maybe part of you thinks that if you keep that left hand in that state, that it'll be a special kind of anchor for your learnings here. And if you were to be stuck at some point else, maybe in clinical practice, maybe that little tingling sensation could remind you of something that you learned here. That would be a nice way of using it, wouldn't it? Good, good. Now, the interesting thing about this trance, how many of you felt like you were in a trance? Really? You did? Uh-oh. You didn't look like you were in a trance. You looked like you could move, most of you, some of each of you. Now, you feel awake, don't you? Are you sure? Are you really sure? Are you sure enough to allow some doubt in? You're not that sure?
Sure.
You're sure?
Not sure.
Is your left hand sure?
Yes.
As sure as the right hand?
Yes.
As sure as your eyelids?
Yes.
As sure as the fact that if you look at me intently, you're not going to be able to say your name? Try. Now look away. What is your name? Yeah. Now, how does that work? Thank you. How does that work? Beats the shit out of me, right? Any thoughts? There's no wrong answers. Are you awake? Are you sure? No thoughts. Awake, but no thoughts. Okay. Okay. Well, I'm going to let that sit for a while, I think. Well, we trace back hypnosis really back to Franz Anton Mesmer. He was the Austrian physicist and philosopher who was one of the what we refer to as an early animal magnetist. And the animal magnetists had an interesting notion about what we now refer to as hypnosis. They thought that something went from the operator, some influence went from the operator, traveled through an invisible medium referred to as an ether, and then went into the subject and put the subject to sleep. This animal magnetism tradition carried on even into this early 20th century. And some of the turn of the century books, instructional books on hypnosis, caution the neophyte operator that if you're not careful, that your influence will come from you, bounce off the subject, and come back and put you to sleep. And so they sort of lost the metaphor, it seems to me, and thought that there was something actually passing through the air or through this ether. Well, this led to a series of interesting kinds of practices. Notably, I'm thinking of James Esdale, who was a British Army physician who practiced in India in the mid-1800s, or actually early 1800s, 1836, if I'm not mistaken, was when he wrote his book. Called Mesmerism in India. And they believed this notion that something went from the operator into the subject. If you were in India with Esdale and you were going to have your limb amputated, he described, by the way, a series, I think, of 82 major surgeries, limb amputations, removal of tumors. The one that struck me the most, I can sort of fixated on this ever since I read the book, was a man who had an 80-pound scrotal tumor. that he was using as a writing desk. And this was removed using mesmerism. They did what were referred to as mesmeric passes. They would do it for hours. And in fact, they would hire native boys to come in and take over when the physician got tired. And then they would go and proceed to do the surgery. And that was hypnosis in the mid-1800s in India. Scary stuff. Now, of course, we need to consider some cultural things, too. We need to consider that in India, trance is much more of an acceptable experience than it is here in the West. So he had that advantage. But nevertheless, that was pretty impressive. Now, believing, and I might tell you, this is one of the books that Erickson told me to read. He told me to read a bunch of old ones, and this was one. And it's a classic. Sometimes you can find it in old bookstores. Someday, I'm sure they'll issue a reprint of it because it's a dandy little book. But believing that this influence went from the operator into the subject, and I'm going to point in a few moments to how this underlies pre-Ericksonian some of our assumptions about hypnosis, that patients are people with suggestion deficiencies, for example, that what we need to do is open their heads up and pour in some good stuff and send them on their way, because something comes from the operator and goes into the subject. But believing this, they thought that you could also magnetize inanimate objects, such as bottles of water. And so they started magnetizing bottles of water, these big jugs of water. And they would do this on them for a few hours. And then they'd set them next to the subject, and guess what? Subjects would go into a trance, and they would do the surgeries that way. So they started storing this water, because it was a lot easier. Now, however, he describes in there a double-blind experiment that to this day is pretty amazing. That is, they would magnetize the water and set it behind the wall. The subject, not knowing that the water was there, and the operators on this side of the wall not knowing if the water was there or not, would then place a subject next to the wall. And guess what? The subjects would go into a trance and they would do the surgeries. It's kind of interesting. Now, some people these days are trying to explain this in terms of energy auras and this and that and the other, and I don't know very much about that, so I'm not going to even talk about it, but perhaps. I tend to think of it, of course, in terms of suggestion, that there was the expectancy developed in the subject that, why are you here? Well, you're here to have yourself cut on, and it's probably best if you're not too awake to that when it happens, because the controls didn't go into a trance. This notion that something comes from the operator and goes to the subject, though, that's what I want you to keep in mind from the mesmeric tradition, because that underlied then the rest of hypnotic tradition, really until Erickson. I might add what he was doing. He left this notion of using hand passes, and he had a much more sophisticated setup when he moved to Paris. If you were to go to his studio in Paris, behind black velvet drapes sometimes was a string quartet, because they didn't have Muzak in those days, and so they had live music. And you'd walk in and be very comfortable, and then when it was your turn, you would walk into a room with a few other people, 3 or 4 other people, and a shill, the term, a plant, someone who was a confederate of Mesmer's. And you would sit around this thing called a baquette, which was a bathtub, basically. And in the bathtub was iron filings and glass shavings and water, and sticking out of it were these iron rods, like reinforcement bar that you see in construction, that kind of setup. There has been some speculation that what he actually created was a storage battery without knowing it, and that part of the way this worked was that when people took a hold of these rods, that they would get this jolt. We're not sure about that, but there's been some attempts to duplicate that, and they've failed. But what would happen is you would sit around this tub holding on to one of these bars, and the music would be playing in the background, and all of a sudden the shill would go into a seizure, a crisis as they referred to them. And you pay good money to be there, and so you'd go into a crisis too, because after all, that was why you were there, and you were already told that was what would happen to you if you went there. And so you would go into this crisis and leave, generally speaking, without your hysterical symptom. That's what he mainly worked with. We don't have many of those anymore, those good kind of hysterical conversion symptoms. Just kind of miss those. I did once work with a case of hysterical blindness, though. The only one I've ever seen. The woman woke up the morning after her first intercourse blind. That's how you would be treated by mesmer. You would grab onto this rebar and go into a crisis. And an amazing cure rate. So the French Academy of Sciences, which included such notables as Benjamin Franklin, Guillotine, and Lavoisier, who discovered oxygen, were on the Academy, and they eventually concluded that Mesmer was a fraud. But why was he a fraud? Because all of his results could be attributable to the imagination. And how right they were. So Mesmer died broke, in obscurity, and discredited. And for the next 50, 60 years, the press regularly lambasted the animal magnetists. The resurgence of this animal magnetism movement, then called hypnosis, was really in the mid-1800s, largely with the work of a Scottish physician, James Braid, who lived between 1795 and 1850. In 1843, he published his book called Neurohypnotism, and which he was going to call, he named hypnosis, by the way, from the Greek god Hypnos, the god of sleep and slumber. And his book was called Neurohypnotism. At one point he thought about calling it neuroptism or neuropnosis, one of those two, I can never remember which, in which case we'd be sitting here today studying neuropnology. He was the first one to really begin to say that hypnosis came as a result of suggestion. And this became a very important paradigm shift in the history of hypnosis. But we also have from him another tradition in hypnosis that is not accurate. He believed that the phenomena of hypnosis, or the mechanism of hypnosis, was the tiring of the optic nerve. And he was the one who had us doing eye fixations. In fact, he enlisted his gardener in the task of coming into the room and having him stare at a candle. And let's just try that for a second so we can feel like we're in the mid-1800s. But we don't actually have a candle, so I'll have to make a candle. Not bad, huh? If you just stare at the candle for a while, watch the flickering light. If you can see the flickering light, you're already there. And just watch it and take a few breaths as you watch it and not feel like you have to do anything, but just watch it and stare at it. And as you begin to stare at it, you may begin to notice a few things happening in your vision. Perhaps it gets blurry. Perhaps the eyes have a tendency to sting or get watery. Maybe the eyelids feel heavier. And just watch. And you'll notice after a time that they do begin to feel heavy. And that you do wish that you could close them. And why don't you just, for the sake of the illustration, let them close. Take a few deep breaths. And now take 1 or 2 or 3 deep breaths and find yourself back in the room again at the conclusion of that, fully alert and rested and awake. When you tell somebody take 1 or 2 or 3 deep breaths, what are you doing? You're enlisting the conscious mind because you have to make a choice of 1 or 2 or 3. So that's the wake-up suggestion. So, all right, so if you put your eyes at that level and you stare at something like that, they're going to get heavy, they're going to fatigue, and you're going to want to close them. Well, he believed that the tiring of the optic nerve is what caused hypnosis. What we understand now is even that is at the basis of, or is based on suggestion. But let me just try this with you. And I'm going to ask you in a moment to pinch the back of your hand. Don't do it yet. I'm going to ask you to pinch it till it hurts. Okay, don't injure yourself, but in a moment, because I'm going to ask you to get a baseline. It's not very scientific. But go ahead, pinch it until it hurts. Notice how much pressure you have to leave. Look at your hand afterwards. See the kind of mark you leave. Okay, and note it. Note the hurt. Okay, and then stop. Then I want you to look back at the candle again. We're going to light the candle for this one. And you should stare at the candle flame. And here's the assignment. Don't let the candle flame go out of focus. And don't look away from it. Okay? That's the only rule. As you continue to look at it and don't look away, pinch your hand again as hard as you did before. Continue to look at it. Don't let it go away. And pinch it like you did before. All right, now stop. Now what did you notice? And generally speaking, what you'll find is that it's less sensitive. And why is that? Your attention is away. Pain is an internal experience, isn't it? And so if you're external, like the fixation point in the Lamaze method, you're outside of yourself. Okay? You create the experience that you can then use. So we know that your eyes are going to get tired. If I begin to suggest to you something that's already going to happen, it's a pretty good chance that you will believe at some level that you're following my suggestions. Very simple. So he believed that. And that's where we get the heavy, sleepy, drowsy metaphor, because they lost the metaphor. They believed the metaphor, I guess I should say, that hypnosis was sleep. Hypnosis, sleep, eyes tiring, sleep. Well, as we know, hypnosis is not sleep. In fact, it's been shown time and time again that the sensory apparatus works even better in a state of hypnosis than it does in the awake state. You are actually in some ways more alert when you're in a state of hypnosis than when you're in the waking state. Well, Braid was a heavy influence on Hippolyte Bernheim, and now we begin to move into the late 1800s. And Bernheim, along with Charcot, were the two major schools of thought of the day. Charcot, who unfortunately influenced Freud more than Bernheim, believed that hypnosis was an hysterical disease state, and that only happened in people who were sick in some ways, and he worked considerably with conversion symptoms and the like. Bernheim believed, however, that hypnosis was also based on suggestion, and wrote his famous book, which is now in reprint, called Suggestive Therapeutics. Unfortunately, it was Charcot that influenced Freud more than Bernheim, and the modern history of psychiatry would be very different. We come to Freud and Freud's collaboration with Breuer, and the foundations of psychoanalysis being in their experimental work using hypnosis with trauma victims. Later on, of course, Freud abandoned the notion that trauma caused difficulties in people and rather insisted that fantasy caused difficulties in people. Well, modern hypnotherapy grew out of this magnetic healing tradition with its notions that something comes from the operator and influences the subject. We had to get all the way to Erickson before we began to appreciate that our job as hypnotherapists was not so much to add suggestion where suggestion did not exist, but rather to dehypnotize people and call up potentials in people. And that people all had the capacity to go into trances, that trance was a common everyday experience. When you listen to descriptions from traditional hypnotherapists, non-Ericksonian hypnotherapists, what you hear very frequently is that the operator is left out of the description of the hypnotic equation. You will talk about the subject responded in the following ways: the subject did this, subject did that, subject resisted, subject did well. But what you never hear is a description of the operator as a part of the hypnotic relationship. It was Erickson's contribution that began to show that rather than needing to add something to someone, that we could collaborate with them and call up their potentials. Let me give you a simple clinical example of that, just to illustrate the point. A woman came to see me once who had a fear of speaking before audiences. She'd been elected to the presidency of a club, which was going to require her to run meetings and give talks and reports, and she would have anxiety attacks, as a matter of fact, when she thought about doing this. Well, it just so happened that she was a professional ballerina, and a very accomplished one at that, and had for years been used to performing in front of audiences. Well, the process there wasn't so much of seeing her as deficient and needing to add something to her, but rather to take the skills and abilities she already had in one context, that is the context of professional dancing, and translate it into another context, that is the context of public speaking. In a simple example, that's what I mean by eliciting potentials as opposed to adding something. So Erickson's contributions include the notion that the client has the necessary resources. I'll add, that's a pretty good myth. It isn't always true, but it's a useful operational myth. Now, you can help them construct the experience. For example, I'll oftentimes give people the assignment to get up on a Saturday morning and go to the market and to unconsciously notice certain things. Notice how couples are with each other, for example, or notice how people say hello and how they say goodbye and how they deal with personal boundaries and issues of personal space and all of that. So you can help them construct the experience, but it isn't always the case that the resource is there. I think as an initial assumption, it's not a bad assumption to have. So he contributed this. He also contributed the notion that it didn't take this kind of authoritarian, Svengalian sort of character to put somebody in a trance. Again, this comes from the early mesmeric tradition, that we did it to you. He pioneered the indirect, permissive approach. Now, when I spoke to you earlier, and we played like we did in the beginning, I never told you to do anything, if you think back over what I said. At no point did I say, you will do this. I said you could, you might find this, if you found this, you could find that. I don't know if this is going to happen, what do you think? That kind of talk. And obviously it was very effective. But it was an indirect, permissive approach. Our subjects are much more sophisticated. Having been in this business just for 15 years, but nevertheless a very important 15 years in terms of it being, in this Ericksonian and post-Ericksonian era, I find that subjects are a lot more sophisticated these days. They're not going to settle for me swinging watches in their faces anymore. Some do, and if that's what they ask for, that's what they get, of course. But the subjects are much more sophisticated. You can read about this stuff in Cosmopolitan magazine now. And subjects have more of a sense of this being part of meditation and relaxation, and so you can't do much of that authoritarian stuff anymore. At least I can't. He also, as long as we're on Erickson, he also gave us a variety of new approaches to induction, not only a different paradigm, but new inductions. He is to be credited with the early learning set induction. And this is an induction where you basically remind somebody of a state in their life in which they were receptive to learning. I did this in myself, unknowingly, not knowing that this is what it was, but he has credit for it, even though I parallel discovered it. When I was trying to do hypnosis on myself, I wanted to achieve a deep trance auto-hypnotically, which has some measure of difficulty. I was eventually able to do it, and since then I've used trance in a variety of interesting applications. This is a cap, by the way, and this, among other kind of medical procedures I've had, was done solely with hypnosis. But I wasn't able to do this for the first few years of practice. As a matter of fact, for the first few years of practice, I was afraid of making eye contact with hypnotists. I would go see local stage hypnotists and kind of sit in the back and hope that he wouldn't get me. So I had all kinds of superstitions about it. And I was too adult. My definition of a child is that there are people who don't yet know that certain things are impossible. And I was certainly not a child. I was very left-brain, linear. I was trying at one point not too much before that, to be a scientist, a physicist, and very linearly oriented. So I wasn't a good subject. But I reasoned that there had been a time in my life when I had been a good subject. We know that between the ages of 7 and 12, there's a sort of ideal ages for subjects, because generally speaking, they're in trance anyway. The brainwave states, the signature brainwave states in children approximately equal their ages. So, for example, an alpha state we say is the average of 8 to 14 cycles per second. Well, 8 to 14-year-olds are approximately in alpha state. Some of them are much deeper, actually, but they're in that state anyway. And theta being 4 to 7, 4 to 7-year-olds are approximately in that state. Delta being 0 to 3, 0 to 3-year-olds are approximately in that state as well, which is achievable only by 0 to 3-year-olds or yogis who practice for 50 years. So I reasoned that at the age of 12, I was sort of in wonderment of the world and was much more right-brain oriented at the time. And I thought, well, when I was 12, if someone had taught me this, I would know it. So what I did was, for a period of 6 weeks, every night when I went to bed, I just lied there before I went to sleep and tried to remember as much as I could about being 12. How it felt, what my memories were, what my associations were, how my thoughts worked, how my body worked. And after 6 weeks, I could go to my bed, close my eyes, and be 12. Okay. That is not a suggestion. Once I was 12, it was very simple to do an induction. I did a very straight-ahead progressive relaxation induction and achieved a deep trance for the first time. So this was the early learning set induction. You've heard the classical, if you've read anything of Erickson's work, you've heard the classical ABCs induction, which goes something like, when you were a child and you first learned to write the ABCs, it was a difficult task, and he reminds you of this. And you didn't know if an M was a 3 on its side. And you get back thinking about that. Or when you first learned to drive a car, you remember how difficult it was. I don't know if you learned how to drive a stick shift or a standard transmission or an automatic transmission, but if you were like me and you learned how to drive a stick shift, you had to kill the car a number of times, and you'd probably be practicing parking lots. And now, as I'm talking about this, what's happening to you? Tell me. You're remembering. Okay, and what's happening to the room while you're remembering? It's going away. Okay, that's a trance. A trance is that inward state of focus. Now, there are trances that are external states of focus, too. Those of you who are runners, you know about runner's high? Okay, that's an externally focused trance, isn't it? Where you're out there and your body's gone. The fixation point in natural childbirth is an externally focused trance. So they have their use as well. But we're generally talking about an inner state of focus. And that's what was beginning to happen. You were remembering those things. That's the early learning set induction. So the early learning set induction was one of his contributions. He also gave us the naturalistic induction. That is, piggybacking on naturalistic trance that already exists. You've heard this before. We've all seen people in our practice who space out. Okay? If you work with drug users, where dissociation itself is a coping strategy, these are people who do this naturalistically. And you just wait till you see it happening in your office, and then you give them messages that will be received more than if they're in that left brain kind of wide awake place. So he pioneered this use of naturalistic states. And his contribution, of course, said that hypnosis is an everyday psychosocial experience. We all go in and out of it. What are some examples of a naturalistic state of hypnosis? Driving. Daydreaming. Twilight state of sleep. You've all had the experience of driving down the freeway on a Saturday morning and going to the market and you end up at your office? It's because you had a program in there driving for you. You were gone. You were someplace else. All right, so those are naturalistic states that can be utilized. When people come in and they practice meditation, and they say, I don't know how I feel about hypnosis, but meditation is okay, say, fine. Why don't you just meditate and I'll talk to you while you meditate? He coined the surprise induction. I sort of demonstrated that a little bit with Russ when, after I brought you back, I went over to Russ again and asked him if he was sure he was awake, and suggested that perhaps he couldn't remember or couldn't say his name. Surprise induction is basically where you set up the expectancy of something going to happen, and then you do it. It's sort of like what I was doing with you in the beginning when I was talking about this thing I was going to ask you to do, and you were waiting for me to ask you to do it, and you would have done anything at that point just to get it over with. So that's an example of that. There's a lot more to the surprise induction than the famous one that he wrote about was saying to a boy in his office, oh, by the way, is that puppy over there the same kind of dog that you have, or the same color? But what he leaves out of the description, unfortunately, and it makes it sound too magical, is all the preparation for something like that. You really do have to increase and enhance expectancy for something like that to work. I remember going to a costume party early in my hypnotic training where a bunch of us from the school were, and one man dressed in pantaloons and a turban. And there were people there who were hypnotists and non-hypnotists. And I watched him do this all night. He'd walk around and people would say, why, what are you? And as soon as they would ask him what he was, he would say, I'm a hypnotist. Why? Sleep. And people would fall out. setting up the expectancy. And then the surprise was, as soon as they're processing hypnotist, they're distracted and he works in the suggestion. Why do a trance induction? Information, bypass resistance, bypass the conscious. I'll tell you what Erickson said. In 1962, Erickson said, you do a trance induction to engage the client's cooperation. You get them responding to you. He was asked what kind of people make the best demonstration subjects, and he said, well, the best demonstration subjects are the people who before the lecture help you unstack the chairs because they're already responding to you. Okay. So the idea of the induction is to engage cooperation. It's a mutual process. So I'd like to talk a little bit about pre-induction talk. So in the pre-induction talk, one of the objectives is to address the misconceptions. Other objectives are to create a climate of rapport and mutual cooperation and focus mutual expectations. You have to find out what are their expectations of hypnosis, what do they think hypnosis is, what do they know about hypnosis. I may just ask that question. What do you know about hypnosis? Well, I know that it's done on the stage, or I know that it's done here. I guess you can do weight loss with it or whatever. What do you think hypnosis will be like for you? Have you had hypnotic experiences before? What were they like? How did it work for you? How did they count? And what did they do? So you want to find out what their experience is. And they will tell you their misconceptions. They will also tell you, more specifically, experiences they have that they may associate with hypnosis that may be frightening. Loss of control, such as anesthesia. A lot of people who've had anesthesia begin to, at a kinesthetic level, associate to the anesthesia, and you need to break that association. For them, you may want to talk about something perhaps more cerebral or bushy-tailed, wide-awake kind of experience, or maybe more visualization experience, but something that will break the association to the anesthesia. So what is their expectation of hypnosis? How do they think it works? And then you'll hear from them their misconceptions. I want to address the general ones that I've heard in my career, and I'll talk a little bit about how I approach them. The first one is the confusion with sleep or unconsciousness, that somehow I'm going to be out. And one of the typical reports you'll hear from a subject after the first trance experience is, gee, it must not have worked because I could hear everything you said. Okay, you all heard that before. Okay. It's really kind of silly when you think about that, though, because if you couldn't hear what I was saying, how in the heck could I induce you? But okay. So it's important as you set up the expectations for doing hypnosis, and I'm arguing to do a formal pre-induction talk. As you get more sophisticated at this and do more disguised kinds of inductions, then perhaps that's less important. But I'd like you to be conservative and plodding to begin with. And so I would encourage you for the first, 10,000 hours to do a pre-induction talk. Get used to doing it and anticipating people's concerns and framing them differently and setting up expectations that are reasonable. So I tell my clients, of course you're going to hear what I'm saying. And of course you're going to hear noises outside of you. Would you like it to be different? And the answer is usually no. Now, the noises outside of you may be less relevant to you. They may be farther away. Just as when I'm talking to you now, there are noises outside this room. You could tune into them, but they're less interesting to you. It's that kind of selective awareness or selective attention. So, of course, you're going to hear me speaking to you. Hypnosis is not a state of sleep. It's a state, in essence, of heightened consciousness, where you're more aware. And then we talk sometimes about hyperacuity of senses. People's sensory apparatus actually can work better in a trance than in the so-called waking state. And I've done demonstrations of that before that are pretty amazing, where people can read the phone book like 10 or 12 feet away in a trance. Or one was wonderful. It was this young boy, a 14-year-old boy that I used as a demonstration subject for a couple of workshops years ago. In one particular case, I went to the audience and someone had one of those little tic-tac mints. I put it in my hand and I stood, about as far away as I am from Charlie, like this, and held my hands out. The boy's eyes were closed. I had him open his eyes once I had the tic-tac in my hand, and I said, I want you to tell me what's in my hand and which hand is it in. And you could see him smelling it. And he said, it's peppermint, and it's in that hand.
He smelled it. He was then told that his sense of touch would be 10,000 times more acute than it was normally. And we held out a piece of glass and had him run his hand on it and then said, with his eyes closed, "What did you just touch?" And he said he touched sandpaper. So the senses can operate better. And we talk about, I don't like this term, I've never found a better term, but I always put it in quotes, this sort of sixth sense that people have. That's the kind of thing that wakes you up in the middle of the night when your baby's crying. Or sleep researchers tell us that about 4 or 5 times a night we do wake up and go back to sleep without remembering it. When the neighbor comes home and closes the garage door, that kind of thing. Something alerts us to that. That operates when we're asleep, it operates when we're awake, and it operates in a trance. And you point that out to people. You also point out to people that what they're doing is volitional. I tell them if at any time I'm saying something to you you don't like, you could open your eyes and walk out of the room. People also like to be told that they can resist suggestions. I say, you'll disregard anything that is not of value. If I say something that's offensive inadvertently, or if I say something that doesn't apply to you, don't worry about it. Your unconscious mind has a filtering process that will filter that out. You will not regard it. And which moves us to the second major kind of concern, and that's the issue over control. When you design your induction strategy, you want to take into account, and I'll talk more about this when I talk about the assessment scheme, but you want to take into account what people's hooks are, what are their so-called personality values, what's important to them. A lot of people have control as a value. Not everybody, but a lot of people do. So you want to frame your induction in ways that provide them with control. You heard me this morning. Because I didn't know you, I assumed that issue of control would be there. So I would say things like, could you make your hands numb enough so that you're heavy enough so you couldn't lift them? Would you be willing to do that? Where the control is clearly within the client. One useful statement to keep in mind is that all hypnosis is self-hypnosis. That all I act as is as a catalyst for you to access those potentials in you. You tell the client that. This isn't me doing something to you. This is us in a partnership doing something together. I have some responsibilities in that process. You have some responsibilities in that process. And it's a team. Together, perhaps we can help you. You get over this idea of an influence one over the other, which comes from our kind of Svengali-ish background or Rasputin kind of connotation of hypnosis. You know who Svengali was? Do you know the story of Svengali? You know the novel Trilby by Georges du Maurier? Trilby was a seamstress, and Svengali, this character, was a hypnotist, and in exchange for her sexual favors, he turned her into an opera singer. And this is the Svengali notion, that somehow we subvert our own will to the will of the hypnotherapist. Clearly, when we were doing more of the direct kind of authoritarian inductions, it was more reasonable for people to conclude that. Obviously, it's his will over hers, and the hypnotic gaze and all of that kind of stuff, you know. When I do trance inductions, by the way, I was taught to have people look in my eyes, but it was so damned uncomfortable for me that I pioneered having people look at their hands because they wouldn't look at me. The other reason was because in the early days I would read scripts, and when they were looking at their hands, they wouldn't see me slip the script out from beneath the chair. So you get away from this idea that it's my influence over you. It's a partnership. And I talk to people about eliciting potentials, and I talk about trance as a naturalistic, everyday occurrence. We've all had the experience of being in a daydream. We've all had the experience of twilight state of sleep, and that tends to normalize it. Some people have a notion that hypnosis is addictive and that it will weaken the will. And a number of traditions teaches. Transcendental meditation talks this way, as a matter of fact. TM is not addictive, but hypnosis is, and it will weaken your will. And I just address that point blank, say, no, what we're attempting to do is increase your will. What we're attempting to do is make you stronger, not weaker. You can use more of yourself as opposed to less of yourself, so that you'll be stronger, not weaker. Then there's the notion of antisocial uses. Can you make me do something I don't want to do? And I usually cite a number of research studies in this regard. Erickson did a series of, if I'm not mistaken, 39 subjects, where he attempted to get them to do antisocial things. I think the primary behavior he wanted them to do was steal their roommate's mail. He found a variety of behaviors that, and I'll just describe the range of them, but he couldn't get anybody to do it. They were selected to be excellent subjects, that is, subjects who could develop complete amnesia for the intervention. In a percentile, that's probably, 10 to 15% of the population. They were chosen for that, who didn't need a lot of training to do it, let me say that as well. So he'd given the suggestion they steal their roommate's mail, they wouldn't remember it, they'd go home. Some of them came back and said, I don't know what it is about you, Erickson, but I don't like you, and I don't want to work with you anymore, not knowing what the suggestions were. Others found themselves reaching for the mail, but would get sick. Would get nauseous. The more they tried to reach, the more nauseous they would get, and they would decide they didn't want to do it. Others completely disregarded the suggestion. No one, in fact, stole the mail and moved on, of the 39 subjects. I cite that study. There was a study done by Hilgard at Stanford where they placed poisonous snakes in non-reflecting glass cages and then took subjects who were hypnotized and told them to reach for the snake. When you're hypnotized, your vision's a little bit blurry, so that coupled with the fact that the glass was non-reflecting meant that they didn't see the glass. Well, some of them did reach for the snakes. Many didn't, but some did. And so people say, aha, there's the antisocial use. Well, except that, consider the following. Here they are at Stanford, knowing that Stanford isn't going to put them in any kind of danger like that. Their liability would go through the ceiling. So the people that did reach for the snake said, I knew it looked like I was in trouble, but I didn't believe that the university would do that to me, so I knew it was safe to reach for it. Okay? So I cite that study. And then again, if the person really has concerns about that, of course, I'm interested in what they're projecting on me. How do you explain the notion of people going up on a stage with a stage hypnotist and doing these silly things and telling them they still have control? How do you reconcile the two? The way I talk about that is in the following way, and it's true. Most of the people who go up on stage for a stage hypnotist have been there before. If a stage hypnotist has been in the area for any length of time, you can count on the fact that 60% or more of the subjects on the stage have been there before. The reason they go there is because they like trance. Think of it in terms of it's a small price to pay to do that. Okay, I talk about it that way. They don't have to do those things. They elect to do those things in order to have the experience of the trance. They made choice about doing that. They decided at some unconscious level it was okay for them to do that, because you will also see people on the stage who will not elect to do certain things. And they have control over that. Not everybody does everything the hypnotist suggests. People have to volunteer for that. I'm a person who would not volunteer to do that. Now, I've been in the audience with stage hypnotists before where I went under, but when he told me to do certain things, I simply didn't do them. But I was very clearly hypnotized. So you do have choice about that. It'd be an interesting study, I don't know if it's ever been done, to study personality traits of people who volunteer to go up in the first place. I assume that there's, some need to show up. I would assume that. You can manipulate people. There's no question about that. Is it unique to hypnosis? No. If not, there'd be no therapy. Our job is to get people to do things they don't want to do, right? Yeah. No. So I always fall back on the question of rapport. Then I make the point, some people kill themselves with barbiturates. Doesn't mean barbiturates are bad. Well, no. These are very powerful tools. You've come to see me as a therapist. You've developed some trust in me to work with you in this way. You have to trust that I'm not going to behave in this way with you. If you don't trust that, I'm not going to do hypnosis with you until you do. If you can't trust that with me, you ought not to be seeing me. And that's generally how I would handle something like that. Then there's the fear, I'm not going to come out of the trance. And I usually proceed as follows. In the history of hypnosis, no one has ever stayed in a trance that wanted to come out. Now, and you probably found in your small groups, you probably had feedback to the effect that I didn't want to come out, okay, because it's so pleasant. So people sometimes will resist your directive that they come back out because they're enjoying themselves, not because they can't come out. Another reason, and this is rare, but another reason that they will resist is that they're acting out. They don't like something you did. and they're trying to grasp control from you. I remember a famous story. Paul Václavic was working with a subject where apparently this was going on. It was a male subject. They did hypnosis. It was time for the hour. The hour was up. It was time to come out of the trance, and Paul told him to come back out, and the man didn't come back out. And then he told him to come out again, and he didn't come out. And he tried all these techniques to get him to come out, even these really ancient techniques that stage hypnotists used to use, where you'd blow in a person's eyelids to wake them up. And he tried that, and that didn't work. And the man just sat there. So what do we do when we get stuck? We utilize the behavior. Okay, anything can be utilized. So here's what he did, and I tell this story to clients because it really dissuades them of the idea that you get stuck in a trance. Paul said, well, that's fine. If you want to stay in the trance, I can understand that. I feel obligated, however, to tell you that it's a very busy day here at the clinic. And there's a lot of people who want to get into the office today, so we'll have to charge you $25 a minute for every minute you go over the session. Well, he came back in about 2 cents worth, you know. So clearly there's volition to that. There's control to that. The person who has real issues of control that persist in spite of your pre-induction talk, remember the fractionation method, and also tell them in the trance that they can resist what you're telling them to do. Give them a directive that they then prove to themselves they can resist. In a moment, I'm going to tell you that your eyes are locked. You can't open them. You will find, however, that you have the ability to ignore this suggestion if you wish to. It's kind of an interesting sort of paradox because you're telling them that they can resist. They don't usually figure that out, but and then they open their eyes. Oh, that's nice to know. I can do this if I want to. So you give them that sense of control. Then there's the question of sexual transferences. When I first studied hypnosis, it wasn't that long ago, it was about 15 years ago, I was told never do hypnosis with a woman without a chaperone in the room because there's, you know, this trilby, Svengali kind of thing. I assume you know something about managing those kinds of transferences. There's something in the hypnotic equation that is very intimate. You know, there's something very intimate about being in the room with your eyes closed, vulnerable, your insides on the outside, if you will. There is something vulnerable about that. Some people tend to sexualize relationships. If you're with someone who sexualizes relationships, be very careful about that. But be aware that those sexual transferences can happen, and they probably happen a little bit more in hypnotic technique. People have a mistaken notion of what hypnosis is and how it works. They have the notion that hypnosis is symptom removal. And of course, we have a rich tradition dating back even pre-Freud of symptom removal. So people will say things like, well, how long does it last? If I quit smoking with you, how long will it last? Well, my response to that is, if I simply suggest away the symptom, you don't like cigarettes, will taste bad or whatever, and we don't work on your lifestyle, and we don't work on creating a context that will support the new changes, it may not last very long at all. But if you work from the inside out, building a foundation on which you can support the change, then it can last forever. I'm suspicious of anybody who comes asking for age regression in the beginning. I will generally be very reluctant to do that per their request. I want to know, why do you want to do that? What is it that's dysfunctional? Now, is this just, you're just, interested? Or do you think that going back there is going to change something you want changed? How do you think it'll change that? And I want to ferret out what their model is. Chances are, if someone has something they repressed in their past, for them to come in to see me, and for us in the first few sessions to go after it, is contraindicated. So you've got pre-induction down, right? There are a variety of approaches to induction. Inductions can be formal, or they can be informal. That is, I can say, now we're going to sit down and do a trance, get ready, here we go. Or I can simply notice perhaps that you are in a trance and begin to speak with you that way. Inductions can be heterohypnotic, that is, between two people, or autohypnotic, in and of the self. They can be direct and overt, versus indirect and disguised. This morning I did a very indirect induction with you. That at least at some level, you're a pretty hip audience, so you knew what I was doing, but a lot of people wouldn't know what I was doing. It sounded very conversational, that I was simply telling you what I was going to do. But you know now, if you didn't then, that it was an induction. They can be authoritarian or permissive. This morning was disguised, indirect, and permissive. Okay? I recorded this one. Let me just read you this. I like it. This is indirect permissive. I'm not going to try and induce a trance in you because I think it's your own darn business whether you go into a trance or not. And besides, you know best how and when you learn in your own unique way, so I won't stand in your way of doing it whenever you need to or want to or anywhere that you may choose to do it. And you could choose to do it now, couldn't you? Yes. Okay. So, I mean, that just sounds like just talk, right? But that's an induction. The induction can be active or passive. Now I want you to put your hands in your lap, focus down at your ring, take a deep breath, look at it, and here we go, would be active. Passive might be, perhaps even more what I was doing this morning might be, well listen, why don't you sit there and let me know when you begin to feel some sense of relaxation. Okay, I'm feeling it. Okay. Well, would you like to do more? Okay. Well, go ahead and deepen it a little bit and let me know when it's deeper. That would be a passive approach to induction. And then there's the expectant approach to induction, and that was also contained in what I did with you this morning. I was building expectancy. Some of the classical expectant techniques are to have a person stare at an hourglass and tell them that as the sand drifts on down, they're becoming more and more relaxed, but don't go all the way into a trance until the last grain of sand has gone down. And so you get this fixation and expectancy. And of course the eye fixation induction is an example of an expectancy induction where you're telling them that they're looking at something and after a while their eyes are going to grow heavy, their eyelids will want to close, begin to look for that. As soon as they begin to feel that, begin to respond to it. So that's an example of expectancy. I'd like to give you an outline, a la Erickson from 1962, of what the trance induction process looks like. Although it's Erickson, it's non-Ericksonian. This is Erickson's notion of what a direct induction looks like. And it looks something like this. There's the fixation of attention. And you begin externally and you begin to move it internally. This is the first stage of the induction. Now, if you think about the various inductions we've done today so far and what I did with you this morning, we started out with this. If through no other means than simply asking you to listen to me, I focused your attention externally. And then I gave you some choices about some internal experiences to have, such as the experience of paresthesia or numbness. So we began to shuttle that awareness from external to internal. Okay? And that was the first step in it. And just to tell you how non-Ericksonian Erickson was this time, he said that an important part of induction was relaxation. And then he said the next process was suggestion. And the suggestion had two components to it. One was to intensify the experience selectively. You remember me saying to you when you started feeling the paresthesias, could you let it travel up your arm? Or maybe it will travel up your arm. Or could you just forget about the sounds outside and listen more intently to what I'm saying, as though you were trying to memorize each word? Might be typical language. So through suggestion, I'm intensifying the experience selectively. But I'm also, through suggestion, obscuring other parts of experience, such as the sounds outside of the room or the people around you. You can, as you listen to me, be a part and apart from the group in the room. Would be a suggestion to intensify your experience with me and to obscure your experience of the other people in the room. You follow? Then, the next stage, these weren't necessarily linear, but they tended to be, was idiomotor activity. And you remember the term comes from William James, and the idea is that a thought tends to be acted out in action. So you would find unconscious head nods, for example, in agreement with what you were saying, or things like an arm levitation induction, which is an idiomotor movement. Or you find, if you watch very carefully, you'll see people agreeing or disagreeing with their suggestions. There is that almost imperceptible head nod when they agree with what you're saying, or maybe a little smile even when they got what you're saying. And that's okay. In fact, it's good. Then idiosensory activity, that is, imagery, for example, is idiosensory activity. as opposed to ideomotor, motor meaning to move, sensory meaning internal kinds of sensory experiences. And this is where we get into the internal representations being auditory, visual, kinesthetic, etc. You intensify those kinds of activities. Could you tell me what it's like being in the bottom of the rowboat going down the river? What do you know about that? Well, it's nice, I feel the rocking motion. Yes, and you feel that rocking motion, don't you? Okay, that would be intensifying idiosensory activity. Then, dissociative processes. And so as you are lying in the bottom of the rowboat going down the river, there's no need to be a part of what's around you. You can be independent from your experience of outside reality. As that part of you is paying attention to your experience of being in the bottom of the rowboat, you can forget about that body. There's a number of ways to elicit regressive processes. Sometimes it's just tone of voice. And it's really fun being in the bottom of the rowboat going down the stream, isn't it? And you can remember the kind of excitement you had as a child when you learned something new. Anything which has the word remember in it is regressive. Remember a time when you were every bit as relaxed as you are now, and maybe even become more relaxed. Anything with remember is a regressive process. He then suggested, and there's debate about this, amnestic processes. These would be saying, for example, and there's no need to have to remember all of this because all of this is recorded as mental notes in your unconscious mind. It would take too much energy anyway to have to remember consciously, so let your unconscious remember for you. And it can remember, now we're back to regressive and amnestic, it can remember a time in which you were very, very relaxed without you even needing to think about it. Beginning to tie the two together. And then the last part of the process was minimal and selective responsiveness. Basically what he means here is what we call the notion of compounding, that each step of the process is based upon an already accomplished step. If you're going to do, let's just take an example, if you're going to do an arm levitation induction, then you start with a twitch in a single finger. Once that's accomplished, then maybe the twitch can spread to another part of the hand. Or when we did the glove anesthesia, the numbness in the hand, I said, perhaps it begins in the edge of the hand, or I might have said in the tips of the fingers and moves to the rest of the hand. So that you get an experience of a minimal or a selective response to what I'm saying, and you compound based upon that, using causal linkages. Because you now are able to experience that in the little finger of your hand, why not simply let the other hand begin to catch up in its own way? Would be an example of linking those two. And this was, according to Erickson, the structure of hypnosis, of hypnotic induction. Now, Jeff Zeig took this and went a step farther with it, and let me give you his rendition of it. Jeff Zeig, the president of the Erickson Foundation. He said, yeah, first you guide the attentiveness from external to internal. He took out this relaxation step, and in its place he said you build responsiveness. And we've talked about that a lot today, about building response potential and expectancy. Then rather than talking in terms of suggestion, he says what you do is guide the subject's associations. So rather than suggesting that you're in a rowboat going down a river, I would say, and this feeling of relaxation can remind you of a time which you were very relaxed. Perhaps it is like a time that you could imagine lying in the bottom of a rowboat going down the stream. As you do that, you then notice a tree. As you walk over to the tree, perhaps you feel a sense of relaxation and realize you want to sit down and take a nap underneath the tree. As you're taking this nap underneath the tree, you have a dream. And in this dream, you imagine potentials undreamt of before, guiding the associations. Then he agreed that regressive processes were useful, like remembering. And he reversed these. I don't know if that's important, but he put dissociation next, and would make statements such as your conscious mind can listen as your unconscious mind even now is exploring those times in your life in which you were very relaxed, and you can recall those times now as though you were back in those times, but take my voice with you wherever you go. Would be an example of combining dissociation and regression, right? And basically then the rest was the same. But so this is the structure of traditional inductions.